Welcome to the Black Creator Series, brought to you by Candlewick Press in collaboration with Red Clay Educators, hosted by Dr. Sonja Cherry-Paul, bringing dynamic books, authors, illustrators, and artists to your classroom and to the world. Look for episodes of the Black Creator Series on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts. Our guest creator this episode is UK Children's Laureate Joseph Coelho, whose first book with Candlewick Press, 10-word Tiny Tales to Inspire and Unsettle, presents 20 tiny tales, each one illustrated by a different artist, and each one just 10 words long in a book that is as much a work of art as an invitation to budding writers. Here's your host, New York Times best-selling author Dr. Sonja Cherry-Paul, founder of Red Clay Educators and co-founder of the Institute for Racial Equity in Literacy.
Joseph, welcome to the Black Creator Series.
Thank you so much for having me, Sonia. It's lovely to be here.
So in the poem Poetry, Pablo Neruda says, "And it was at that age poetry arrived in search of me." And because you are a poet, I wanted to ask, how did poetry first find you?
I think poetry first found me sort of at home through the playing with language. I didn't really come from a home full of books, but what my family did do was play with words, play with language. We would make up little ditties and rhymes, do a lot of punning. And so from a very early age, I was very comfortable playing with words and language. And then I guess kind of formal poetry came sort of later. And by the time I discovered poetry as a medium, I was just very comfortable. I didn't feel any of the pressure to kind of, oh, it's a poem and it must be done in a certain way. I just felt like I could play. Yeah. So I'd say playing with words from an early age.
I love that so much. I am a former classroom teacher. I taught 10, 11, and 12-year-olds. So that's like fifth, sixth, seventh grade here in the United States. And I find that children love to write poetry when teachers create an environment where there aren't restrictions. I think kids feel most free to when they get to compose poetry, when they recognize that poetry isn't only sonnets and acrostics, but the lyrics to their favorite songs, the questions that they wonder about all the time, and so much more. Um, Also, as an educator, I work with teachers and students to better help them understand that there's no such thing as writing that is neutral. A writer's identities, specifically their racial and cultural identities and their background, influences how and what they write. In what ways is your writing a reflection of your identities, your background, your experiences?
I'd say it definitely factors high on it, whatever I write in terms of the worlds I'm creating, the characters that I'm representing, but also my life experience. I write a lot about families in sort of not non-traditional makeups, um, uh, social housing. I grew up on what we call in the UK an estate, like a social estate. So it's not like a posh estate, but like big blocks of flats. Um, so I never saw families in the situations I was in. I was in a single parent family. So I write a lot about single parent families and council estates, and growing up in blocks and combining that with magic, because I definitely felt growing up that magic wasn't something for me. I never saw anyone who looked like me, you
Mm.
know, being given access to a magical world. And it felt like you needed to live in a huge house, in the countryside somewhere in order to get access to Narnia. So I feel very strongly about doing what I can to represent my background and my culture, and putting that in my stories and books.
I think that's so powerful and so true. And what you describe as the estates in the United States I think that would be similar to how I grew up. I grew up in what we call the projects, low income housing, a lot of Black and brown people and families. And I also grew up during the time where hip hop was like emerging. And last year we had the 50th anniversary of hip hop. And we know that hip hop has influenced so much of how we communicate, particularly how we write, how we speak, without getting the full acknowledgement of this that is deserved. And Black children in particular are often made to feel that hip hop music isn't art. And they can be disconnected from this genre born of the literary genius of Black and brown people, their creativity and their practices that gives voice to their lived realities and experiences. And I often wonder, what if schools were spaces that dismantled these barriers between rap and poetry, hip hop and poetry? If educators declared that rap and hip hop is poetry, how might poetry find even more children when all parts of their identities are affirmed? So I'm thinking about that when you're describing how you didn't see yourself always represented in lots of different art forms, right?
Yeah, for sure. And when I started out before I was published, I spent many years working in schools alongside brilliant teachers as a performance poet. So I was unpublished, but I was a performance poet doing creative writing sessions in schools. And I'd often create workshops using things like Tupac's "Sometimes I Cry," like his poetry collection, and saying to kids, look, this is a poetry collection by Tupac. Did you know he wrote poetry? And he'd illustrate, there's like a poem called "Sometimes I Cry," and he's drawn a little eye with teardrops falling down. Like quite sentimental, sort of sensitive poems. And I found it was just such a brilliant way to get kids engaged. Or I do workshops around Shakespeare, but just looking at Shakespearean insults and sort of breaking down how we kind of put the canon sort of up on a pedestal and sort of forget about the people, about the individuals, about the fact that Shakespeare is sort of seen up here and highly lauded, as it should be, but it would have been working class people, freelancers trying to make ends meet, doing their shows and sort of hobbling stuff together, with regional accents. I find it so interesting how in art things become very precious and very proper, even though often they are forms that have come from the streets in many ways.
So you are the Children's Laureate in the UK. What has it been like for you to be the Children's Laureate? What's something surprising or maybe unexpected about this role?
Um, well, you get to represent children's literature and encourage young people to read. And in my case, write. I was very passionate about getting young people to write because that's been my sort of educational background. Um, but the surprising things have just been the range of different requests. So from the very tiny, from parents getting in touch and asking, oh, my daughter dressed up as one of your characters, or they were inspired by one of your poetry prompts to create a poem, to like really massive things like interviewing Queen Camilla, or coming over to the States. And chatting with Meg Medina, your very own ambassador for literature. So it's been such a range of things. I'm still going into schools and doing that thing that I think many authors do. Going into schools and waking up at 5 a.m. and doing the hard graft. But at the same time, I'm also on telly and on the radio. So it's that mix of things, which has been quite surprising.
I want to talk about this incredible book, which I'm going to share here, 10 Word Tiny Tales. What is the story behind the 10 Word Tiny Tale? Pun intended. The title also says these tiny tales are to inspire and unsettle. What are you hoping young readers will be inspired to do and be unsettled about?
Well, drawing on my experience, kind of getting kids to write, I always notice that they they like things that are on the edge of a little bit scary, a little bit thrilling. And so I enjoy sci-fi and horror, um, and wanted to find ways to excite children, to inspire them to make these stories longer. So there's a whole um, story at the beginning where I explain how I found these 10-word tiny tales, how I found some of them scrunched up on pieces of paper on the back of old buses, how I saw some of them written in the clouds, and how I felt I was getting these stories because the stories wanted to be made longer because 10 words isn't quite long enough. And so I want children to be inspired by that and to look at the wonderful illustrations by a whole variety of illustrators from all over the world. We've been really lucky with the illustrators. So my hope is that they will be inspired to make these stories longer. And there are activities at the back of the book as well to take them a bit further down that journey if they get inspired by one of the images and one of the 10-word tales. So hopefully they can make that tale longer for themselves.
I think this is so genius and so welcoming for children who can sometimes be intimidated by, putting pen or pencil to paper, right? Or facing the blank screen. And conciseness is often undervalued in many writing classrooms. There can be this emphasis on quantity that really stops children and halts them in their tracks from being able to produce anything. And so I think that what you have done here, you validate conciseness, you validate brevity, and you create an invitation for kids to crack that open and to do more. And you also talked about the artists, which I want to also spotlight. This book is unique not only in the 10-word tales it offers, but also because of the racially and culturally diverse artists that have contributed to this beautiful book. So, was this intentional? And how do you think the identities of all of you as creators shape this text? And what does it show kids?
Yeah, I thought it was really important to have a range of illustrators from all over the world of different nationalities and ethnicities. One of the first things I do when I take the book into schools is show them that very page to say, look, these are all illustrators, all professional illustrators. You can be an illustrator too. I feel it's so important that kids get to see themselves as the ones who can make books as well. I feel that that's so key because I certainly didn't see that not until sixth form. So when I was 16, 17, at school, we had the wonderful Jamaican poet, Jean Binta Breeze, visited my school and she read a poem. And it was the first time I saw a poet who looked like me, working as a professional poet, and it gave me the first seed of that could be me. And so I'm always so aware of that when I'm writing both characters and situations and settings in my books of what does that represent to the child, but also when I'm working on projects like 10-word tiny tales, how can we push that and ensure that young people get to see themselves represented in the makeup of the people making the books as well.
I think that's incredible. And this book, because of that, it feels like a community and it shows kids the infinite possibilities that exist when they activate their imaginations, sparked by their lived realities and, of course, their backgrounds and identities and experiences. What are you noticing about young people and their writing as you visit kids in schools? How are they responding to 10-word tiny tales as readers and writers and artists?
I see them like feeling energized because certainly in the UK there's not a lot of opportunity for creative writing, and I often get teachers sort of saying, oh, that child never writes, but today look at how much they've written. So I had that just the other day on a 10-word Tiny Tales workshop I was running, where the teacher's holding, the kids had left and their work was kind of on the tables and just holding up all this text, and she goes, "This child never writes." And I feel that's because the 10-word tales are, as you say, they're non-threatening. It's just 10 words. And so there's different levels. A child can make up their own 10-word tale, which is, again, a very non-threatening thing. They can draw a picture for their own 10-word tale, or draw a picture first, then come up with the text, or they can make an existing tale longer. And it's like the brakes are being taken off, and you see them coming up with these very often quite sinister and dark ideas, like one of the images you just shown, of the teacher leading the children through the portal. That is a fantastic image that I use a lot, because the kids start to come up with wonderful ideas. They say, "Oh, the teacher is feeding her monster friend who's on the other side of the portal. The children have been naughty, and so they're going to be eaten by this tentacled being." And they get deeper and darker, and you can feel that sense that they're allowed to be not quite naughty, but just like to push things, to push at the boundaries of what they think they're allowed to write.
I love it. I love it so much. And I want to go back to that word community, because you just offered a bunch of different ways kids can, enter into writing their own tiny word tales, drawing their own tiny 10-word tiny tales. And they could also draw them for each other in the way that this book does, right? So one peer who's written a 10-word tiny tale teams up with another peer who is the illustrator, right? They could also help to develop the story together. And I just think that, building community in our writing spaces for young people is one of the most powerful things that we can do, that it doesn't have to be a solitary experience. Writing can be collaborative. And when that happens, there can just be such richness that it yields. Kids want to find out more information about 10-word tiny tales. Do you have any recommendations?
Absolutely. We have a 10-word Tiny Tales website, which is 10wordstinytales.com. And if you head over to the website, there's a little story generator where you can press a button and it will give you 3 words from the 10-word Tiny Tales book. And you can use those 3 words to create your own 10-word tale. So you've got to create a 10-word tale, including those 3 words. There are also interviews with many of the illustrators from the book. So you'll get to see myself interviewing some of the different illustrators. I think the last one we had was Reggie Brown, actually. So we had a lovely conversation about his picture in the book. And there's a new 10-word Tiny Tales, 10-word Tiny Tales coming out later this year called 10-word Tiny Tales of Love.
What's next for you? Are there any projects that you're working on that you can share that young readers can look forward to?
Sure, there's a few things. So I've just finished a new poetry collection called Spooky Out Loud. So I've got a collection of like picture book format illustrated poetry books illustrated by Daniel Gray Barnett.
Mm.
And there's Poems Aloud, Smile Out Loud, Courage Out Loud, and now Spooky Out Loud. So that'll be coming out in time for Halloween. And I love spooky things, so it's a collection of spooky poems that have been beautifully illustrated. I'm also finishing up a new magical middle grade series. I'm not allowed to say what it's called, but it's coming out with Walker. Watch this space; it will be out later this year. I've had so much fun writing it. It's my first middle grade that isn't strictly in verse. There are verse moments, but it's more prose. And yeah, it features high tech gadgets, magic, time travel, and it's one Londoner. So it's a young black boy from London who lives above an antique shop that's been in his family for generations, and they find something that sets off a whole magical quest. Let's say that.
Joseph, it's so clear how passionate you are about getting kids to read and to write and to love it. You've written that stories are like seeds that need to grow. And your work sparks children's imaginations, inspiring them to cultivate the seeds of their own stories. What does it mean to you to be a Black creator?
Gosh, I feel a sense of responsibility, um, to, to represent, to ensure that, the kids like me and all kids get to see themselves in the worlds that I'm creating. But there's a flip side to that as well, because I also get very aware that, as creators of color, there's also a kind of unfair, um, sense of responsibility where it's, all the panel events tend to be around diversity, which is great, but of course we also need opportunities to just talk about our work, and to talk about the language and to talk about the themes of our work, which could be about all number of things, and to be seen as artists in our own right, not just as, oh, a tick boxing exercise. So I get very aware of that as well, and very conscious of protecting a space for myself as an artist and creating spaces for other artists. So, for instance, I just edited a poetry collection with 10 new voices for children's poetry, completely diverse backgrounds. You there's lots of different cultural backgrounds, class backgrounds, and it was such a joy to just be able to create a series of poems that was just about our life experiences, and it's not, oh, we're only being put together because we're diverse, if you know what I mean. It's about celebrating fantastic poetry first and foremost, but of course it does the thing of letting many young people know that there are writers, there are poets out there that look like them, from backgrounds similar to their own, with families like their own. So it's that balancing act, which really strikes me.
Thank you so much, Joseph.
Thank you. It's been a real pleasure.
Thanks for checking out this episode of the Black Creators Series, a Candlewick Press and Red Clay Educators collaboration. Don't forget to like and subscribe and hit the notifications button so you won't miss an episode. For more information about the Black Creators Series, go to blackcreatorseries.candlewick.com or sonjacherrypaul.com, or go to Red Clay Ed on Twitter and Instagram.